Hello and welcome to notes for 11.2, which is movement, as we continue our exploration of animal physiology. So our essential idea here is that the roles of the musculoskeletal system are movement, support, and protection. The rigid nature of bone both supports and protects organs within the body. It also gives a structure for muscles to pull and by their contraction to create movement. Now, that's not something we usually think of when we talk about bones, but without bones, we would not be able to move. And it also talked about two of the other major roles, which are to support the body. Without the bones, we would not be able to stand up, and to protect the internal organs. Very important. So things like your rib cage serve as protection for those vital internal organs. And here we have our understandings. And in this video, we're going to talk about understandings 1 through 4, and we will address the rest in the part 2 video. And we have our applications and skills here, and we are going to address application 1 and skill 1 here, and then skill 2 and 3 will be addressed through the next set of slides. So let's get started. Bones and exoskeletons provide anchorage for muscles and act as levers. So what that means is muscles need something to which they can attach, and bones provide that service. So if I look down here, I have the knee joint, a very important joint to humans. So if I have a muscle that attaches here and here, so it connects those 2 points, when that muscle shortens, it is going to cause the knee to bend like you see over here. So the muscle needs somewhere to attach to, so that when it shortens, it can pull on those 2 points, pull them closer together, and cause actual movement. And then the places where that movement pivots, where it actually happens, are the joints. So those are the parts of the skeletal system that are important, but how about the rest of the system? It's not just the skeleton working by itself. So we of course have an extensive network of nerves. Nerves are needed to coordinate muscle contractions, they stimulate muscle contractions, they allow your brain to control your body. We have muscles, which are actually applying the effort or force by their contractions, and muscles can only contract, they can only get shorter. So they apply the force on the bones to actually make that movement happen. Tendons are tissues that connect muscle to the bone, and then ligaments are other tissues that connect bone to bone. So for instance, as I said before, I have a muscle that connects above the knee and below the knee. So that muscle on each end is going to have a tendon that connects the muscle to the bone. But then the knee itself, in order to stabilize that structure, is going to have ligaments that connect those bones together and hold them and support them to prevent injury. So those are things like your ACL and your MCL, things that are often injured. Those are ligaments. So our first application, we talk about A1 here, antagonistic pairs of muscles. So if you've heard the word antagonist before, probably in English, you should know that it is something that works against. So books will often have protagonists, which are the main characters, and then antagonists, which work against those main characters. So if we look at grasshoppers, they are insects, which means they, of course, do not have bones, but they do have an exoskeleton. So they have this hard exoskeleton around the outside of their body. The muscles can attach to that instead of attaching to something on the inside and use that as anchorage. The back leg is much longer than the others to aid in jumping, because the longer the legs are, the further the distance through which the jumper can push, and that'll increase the distance of the jump. And then if I look inside of that leg, so over here on this diagram, I have inside of that leg, I have 2 muscles, and those 2 muscles are antagonists. They work in opposite directions. So I have an extensor muscle, which extends the leg, And I have a flexor muscle which contracts the leg. So it contracts to flex the leg. So the extensor muscle contracts to extend the leg, to straighten it out, and the flexor muscle contracts to flex the leg, bend the leg. Those muscles both work on the same joint. They are connected to the same, to very similar positions, not the same positions, but very similar positions. But when each of them contracts, they cause something different to happen. So when this red muscle contracts, it is going to cause this part to straighten out. It's going to have a more obtuse angle here and eventually straighten out. That is extending the leg. Whereas if the blue one contracts, it's going to pull this closer up to that part of the leg, and it is going to flex. So these are antagonistic muscles because they pull that in opposite directions. One of them is going to pull it this way, the other one's going to pull it that way. Antagonistic muscles are really important because you need to be able to move your bones back to their original position after you move them. Something like walking wouldn't work if you couldn't move your leg back into its original position. So those are really important. Antagonistic muscles, when one contracts, the other one relaxes. So when one contracts, the other one relaxes to produce controlled movements. There are a couple of different types of joints that we're going to talk about. The first and pretty simple one of these is the hinge joint. So the elbow is an example of a hinge joint. So you can see here, it's a hinge. It only works in one direction. So you can bend your elbow, you can extend your elbow. That's all. You can't do any other type of movement with your elbow other than bending or extending. All the other movements in your arm come from movements within your wrist and within your shoulder. But there's nothing you can do with your arm other than bend it or extend it. And the antagonistic muscles here are the biceps and the triceps, which some of you will no doubt have heard of because they're two of the most commonly worked out muscles. These are antagonistic. So, to bend the elbow, I need to contract the bicep and relax the tricep. These work in opposite directions, so when one of them contracts, the other one needs to relax. And to get the opposite movement, I need to do the opposite contraction. So now the tricep is contracting and the bicep is relaxing. So you'll notice that when one contracts, the other one must relax. The same situation down here. When one contracts, the other one must relax to allow for that movement. If they both contract, then you are going to get no movement and things are just going to stay static. So those are antagonistic muscles working on a hinge joint. The elbow is a really important example of a joint, and so you need to be able to annotate all these structures. So you need to be able to, on a diagram of the elbow, you should be able to label each one of those structures, and you need to annotate them with their function. So the biceps and triceps are the two main muscles there, but then you have all of the bones that are involved. So I have the humerus, I have the radius and ulna, I have different cartilage, I have synovial fluid, a joint capsule, tendons, and ligaments. So you need to know where all of those are, you need to be able to label it, and you also need to know what they all do. So you might want to pause the video here and copy down these functions because these are functions that you will need to know and they will come up on exams. The knee is a pivotal hinge joint. So what that means is, and if you look at the picture you might see that as well, it is a hinge joint, so it has really similar movement to the elbow. You can flex or extend the knee, but there's a little bit more range of movement. So we have some pivotal movements as well. So the pivotal movement is this movement shown here where that can turn, it can pivot. So in addition to having the hinge movement, which is just the flex or extend, I can have some pivoting as well. This makes the knee one of the most complex joints in the human body. Because it can do both of these motions, it is really delicate. You can see here in this picture, there's a lot of parts that must work together. And that's why the knee is one of the most commonly injured joints as well, especially among athletes, because there is a lot of stress put on the knees. There are a number of structures in place to improve stability. So I have the ACL, I have the PCL. Those are ligaments that are holding those bones together. So they're holding the femur up here above the knee. This bone, they're holding it to the tibia, which is below the knee. I have the patella, which is a bone. It's your kneecap bone. So the patella is a bone, the femur is a bone, the tibia is a bone. I have the meniscus, which is cartilage. You can see here it kind of acts as a cushion or a pillow. So the meniscus sits on top of the tibia and it absorbs some of that force from the femur. And then I have more ligaments with the meniscus. So I have the meniscal ligament that holds the meniscus to the tibia. And then I have some more cartilage up here. This is all cartilage that helps to lubricate the knee joint, make sure everything is moving smoothly, and reduce harm. So both impact harm, like it says over here, but also make sure that those bones can move smoothly across each other. So ideally, like you'll see in this diagram, the femur and the tibia do not actually contact each other, and you can see that as well if you look up here in this diagram. So the femur and the tibia, there's a little bit of space in there. So there's a little space in here. They do not actually touch each other. When they do touch each other, that's when you start to get a lot of pain. It's really painful to have bones rubbing up against each other. So you have all these structures in place to stabilize those bones and to reduce impact of both between those bones as they move together and the impact from things like running, which put a lot more pressure. Every time you take a step when you run, you're putting your full body weight pressing down that femur into the tibia. So you need a lot of different structures to work together to protect that, and that makes the knee very delicate, and it is one of the most commonly injured joints as a result of that. Because if you don't protect it properly, then something's going to go wrong. We have other types of joints as well. The hip is an example of a ball and socket joint. So essentially I have a socket down here. I have the end of a bone is sort of a ball shape that fits into that socket, and then it can just rotate around. So we can see in the x-ray over here, the end of my femur is a ball shape, and it fits right into the socket in the hip, and that means it can give full range of motion. So you can move your hip and your shoulder, because your shoulder is also a ball and socket joint. You can move those full 360 degrees range of motion. So around that, I have some cartilage, again, to protect those bones from rubbing up against each other. And I have a synovial membrane, which is basically just a membrane that covers that entire area. So the synovial membrane covers the whole area, again, for lubrication and protection. So synovial joints, most of your joints are synovial joints. Everything we've talked about so far is a synovial joint. And basically what a synovial joint means is that it is surrounded by a synovial lining. So I'll see down here a joint capsule and synovial lining. So there is a capsule that surrounds this whole joint. There is a cavity in there. There's a little space, there's some cartilage in there, and there's some fluid in there as well. And basically, that is all to protect the joint. So the fluid allows lubrication so that the bones can move easily against each other, and the membrane holds that fluid in. So synovial joints are, all of your joints essentially are synovial joints. So we see up here we have the hip, we have the knee, we have the shoulder, hand, foot, ankle. All of these things we've talked about are synovial joints. And there are different types of synovial joints, which is what we've seen. So that's pretty much everything you need to know about the skeletal system. But before we finish, I'm just going to talk a little bit about muscle structure. So striated muscle cells. Some of you will recognize the term striated muscle fibers from way back in topic 1. And I believe it was even in topic 1.1. So it was the first thing we've ever looked at in DP biology. And we looked at that because it is an exception to normal cell theory. It does not appear as a normal cell. And the reason for that is that the single muscle cell is multinucleated, has multiple nuclei, and then those nuclei are positioned along the edges. We're also going to find a lot of mitochondria in a muscle cell, which makes sense because it needs a lot of ATP. It's doing a lot of motion. That's where all movements in your body happen, is within muscle fibers, so they need a lot of mitochondria so that they have ATP for those movements. Not just your voluntary movements, but also the things like your heartbeat or your breathing or peristalsis in your digestive system. All of these things need to be happening constantly, and so they need mitochondria. And then we'll also see that muscle fibers are held together by the sarcolemma. So the sarcolemma is just basically a plasma membrane that surrounds muscle fibers. So in here, you can see I have individual myofibrils, so individual little strands of muscle cells. These are surrounded with mitochondria. They have nuclei on the outside, and the whole thing is surrounded with the sarcolemma. So this entire thing would be considered a muscle cell. It's a lot more complicated than the normal cells you look at. And that they also have a specialized tissue that is not seen in other places called the sarcoplasmic reticulum. So I can see that in here. It's kind of this mesh net-like network. Basically what that does is it stores calcium ions and pumps them out when the muscle fiber is stimulated. So you'll remember, hopefully, the normal endoplasmic reticulum synthesizes molecules. This works in a similar way in that it stores calcium. You'll also remember, hopefully, from our discussion of nerve stimulation in topic 6, that calcium ions are really important to sending signals between the nerves and what they are sending the signal to. So in this case, it'd be between the nerves and the muscle fibers. So they're going to release calcium ions that are actually going to stimulate the muscle fiber to contract. And then the final thing to note is in here we have these myofibrils. They are the basic contractile units of a muscle group. So they are the individual threads that make up sort of the string of the muscle fiber. They are grouped together inside muscle cells, which are known as muscle fibers. So the entire cell is a muscle fiber. This whole thing is a muscle fiber. But these individual bands in here are myofibrils. So that is where we're going to stop today. We're going to finish up. We have talked about the structure of the skeletal system, as well as the structure of some really important joints, and the basic structure of muscles. Next time, we will talk about how those structures within the muscles actually function to cause the contraction that causes the movement, which is, of course, the name of this subsection. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time.